morning light crept softly through the linen curtains, casting a pale gold hue across the kitchen floor. Emma stood by the counter, cradling a warm mug of tea in both hands, her eyes lingering on the clock above the sink. It was just past 7. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon toast in early summer rain. Outside, drops tapped rhythmically against the window, a calm soundtrack to an otherwise ordinary day. She moved slowly, her swollen belly shifting as she walked. 6 months in, and her body had started to carry the heaviness in every step. But it was a kind of weight she had learned to welcome, a reminder that life was growing, that something real and beautiful was on its way. She paused in front of the mirror by the front door and gently pressed her hand to her stomach. The baby kicked softly in response. She smiled. Daniel emerged from the bedroom, adjusting his tie, his phone already in hand. He glanced at her, briefly, then returned his gaze to the screen. "Big day," Emma said softly, watching him. He nodded without looking up. "I've got a meeting at 9. Can't miss it." She tried to ignore the way her chest tightened at his tone, clipped, distant, as if the life inside her had become background noise. Once, they would have gone together to the doctor's office. He would have held her hand during the ultrasound, whispered names, kissed her temple. But lately his presence felt partial, like he was there, but not really. His mind somewhere else. His body just going through motions. "You sure you can't make it?" she asked, not pleading, just confirming. He finally looked up. "I'm sorry, Em. I really can't today." She nodded, even smiled. She had learned to make disappointment look like understanding. They stood in silence for a moment before he leaned in to kiss her cheek. The touch was brief, mechanical. Then he turned and grabbed his keys from the table. She watched him go without a word. The door clicked shut. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was loaded. Emma exhaled slowly and grabbed her coat. The hospital wasn't far. She didn't mind going alone. She had learned over time to do more and more things without him. As she stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the streets still slick and quiet. She pulled her coat tighter, her steps steady, unaware that today would mark the beginning of the unraveling. That what waited on the other side of this ordinary morning was a truth she had never prepared her heart to face. The hospital lobby hummed with quiet efficiency. Nurses behind glass windows, the soft chime of overhead announcements, the occasional cough from a waiting patient. Emma signed in at the front desk and made her way to the maternity wing. She moved with care, one hand resting instinctively on her belly, her breath even but shallow. The air smelled of antiseptic and freshly mopped floors. She took a seat in the far corner of the waiting room. The chairs were cold, the walls painted a dull beige, and a flickering television played an old talk show with the volume turned low. Around her, the room was nearly empty. Only a young couple sat across from her, whispering to each other in hushed tones, their fingers laced together. Emma looked away. She glanced at the clock again. 8:47. Her appointment was at 9. She thought of texting Daniel but stopped herself. What was there to say? That the baby had been kicking more lately? That she wished he were here? Words, she realized, no longer landed the way they used to. They evaporated before reaching him. The nurse called her name, and Emma stood, adjusting her sweater. The checkup went smoothly. The baby's heartbeat was strong, the measurements healthy, everything just as it should be. As the technician turned the screen toward her and pointed to the tiny profile, Emma felt the familiar ache of joy, the image of her child, small and perfect, floating in a world of quiet safety. She blinked quickly, swallowing the sudden rise of emotion. Afterward, they printed the ultrasound picture and handed it to her. Emma held it gently, like it might shatter. She left the exam room in a daze of fragile happiness, walking slower now, not quite ready to return to the outside world. But somewhere between the maternity wing and the hospital exit, she took a wrong turn. The hallway she entered was quieter, older, fewer people, fewer signs. A nurse passed by with a clipboard, but said nothing. Emma, distracted, followed the hall without thinking, her mind still wrapped in the echo of her baby's heartbeat. And then she saw it. Room 314. The door was slightly ajar. She caught a glimpse first, a flash of familiar posture. A man sitting beside a hospital bed. His back was to her, but something about the way his shoulders curved, the way his hand moved to brush a strand of hair from someone's forehead. It was Daniel, her husband. Emma froze. Inside the room, a young woman lay in the bed, her arm hooked to an IV, her skin pale but soft with comfort. She looked up at him with gratitude, her fingers curled around his hand. Daniel leaned in, whispered something, and smiled in that gentle, intimate way Emma hadn't seen in months. The woman smiled back, and in that instant, something inside Emma cracked. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood in the hall, the ultrasound picture fluttering slightly in her trembling hand. The baby kicked again, but she didn't feel it. Not really. What she felt was cold. The kind of cold that comes not from the outside, but from the collapse of something sacred. It was, without question, Daniel. And that was not kindness in his touch. It was care. Real, rooted care. For someone else. Emma didn't remember making the decision to step forward. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, feet slow but sure against the polished hospital floor. She stopped just outside the doorway, the edge of the frame cool beneath her fingertips. The air inside room 314 felt different, warmer, more intimate. The lights were dimmed, the blinds drawn. A vase of flowers sat on the side table. Lavender and soft pink roses. Not the kind a nurse would bring, the kind someone brings when they care. Daniel sat beside the woman, their hands still joined. He wasn't speaking anymore. He was just looking at her. Tenderness lived in the silence between them, a kind of stillness Emma hadn't known from him in months, maybe longer. Then the woman stirred. She turned her head slightly and caught Emma's reflection in the metal edge of a cabinet. Her expression shifted in an instant, from ease to alarm. Emma stepped fully into the room. Daniel looked up. The moment their eyes met, something in his face dropped. Not confusion, not concern, recognition, guilt. Emma's voice came low, steady. "Who is she?" No one answered. The woman in the bed, Alyssa, as Emma would later learn, adjusted herself, her grip loosening from Daniel's hand. She looked younger up close, maybe late 20s. Her belly was round beneath the hospital blanket. Another pregnancy, another child, another truth Emma had never been given the chance to know. Daniel stood abruptly, words forming and failing at once. "Emma, this isn't..." But there was no room for explanation. Not in this space, not in this moment. Emma's eyes didn't leave his. "How long?" His lips parted. Silence. The answer was in his hesitation. She looked at the woman again, who had now turned her face away in shame or fear, or both. Emma's chest rose once, sharply. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. The silence around her felt louder than any reaction she could muster. Her gaze dropped to the floor, then to the photo still clutched in her hand. The ultrasound print was wrinkled now, smudged slightly at the corner where her fingers had clenched too tightly. Without a word, she turned and walked out. The hallway was suddenly too bright, the lights harsh against her vision. Her heart pounded, not from rage, but from something deeper, something colder. A quiet betrayal that echoed in the walls of her chest. She made it to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. Daniel didn't follow. When the door slid open and she stepped inside, Emma felt as if something irreversible had happened, as if a part of her had stayed behind in that room, on that threshold, frozen in the moment she realized the man she loved was no longer hers, and perhaps hadn't been for a long, long time. The elevator doors closed with a soft hiss, sealing her inside a box of fluorescent light and sterile air. Emma stared at her reflection in the metal wall. She looked calm, too calm. The stillness in her face didn't match the storm brewing underneath. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her eyes remained dry. She stepped out into the lobby without speaking to anyone, without pausing. The ultrasound photo was still in her grip, crumpled beyond recognition. She didn't remember walking to her car, or unlocking the door, or starting the engine. Everything between room 314 and the quiet of the driver's seat blurred into a single hum of disbelief. She didn't drive home, not yet. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel as her mind raced in circles, fragmented memories, half-spoken sentences, moments that now looked different in the harsh light of truth. His late nights, his silence, his sudden tenderness followed by distance. She turned off the engine. 10 minutes later, she was back inside the hospital. Her steps were faster this time, more focused. When she reached the hallway near room 314, she didn't slow down. She walked straight in, her voice steady, her presence undeniable. "Get up." Daniel, still seated by Alyssa's bedside, froze. He looked up, the color draining from his face. Alyssa shifted uncomfortably, already shrinking beneath the blanket. "Emma, please," Daniel began, standing slowly. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" she asked, her voice like glass. "That while I've been carrying your child, you've been building a second life in secret? That you were too busy to come to the ultrasound because you were here, playing husband to someone else?" Alyssa opened her mouth and closed it. She seemed unsure of what role she was meant to play. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Daniel said weakly. It got complicated." Emma laughed, short, breathless, not from humor, but from something sharp and wounded. "Complicated? That's what you call this?" She pointed at Alyssa, at the hospital bed, at the air between them. "You lied to me. Every single day. You let me build a future with you while you kept part of yourself somewhere else." His eyes softened. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me," she repeated, her voice lower now. "But you did. And not just with this." She held up the ultrasound photo, wrinkled and torn. "You weren't there today, Daniel. You were supposed to be there. You promised me that at the very beginning, that we do this together." Daniel looked away. Emma stared at him, letting the silence stretch. Then she turned to Alyssa. "Did you know he was married?" Alyssa hesitated, then nodded. Her eyes were red now. He said it was ending." Emma's mouth tightened. "Of course he did. They always say that." She took one final look at Daniel, memorizing the face of the man she had once trusted with everything. "I'm not coming back," she said simply. "Not to this, not to you." And with that, she turned and walked out once more. But this time, the air behind her didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like space, room to breathe, room to begin again. She didn't look back. The house was quiet when Emma returned, but not in the way quietness usually felt. It wasn't peaceful or still. It was vacant, hollow, like the walls themselves had absorbed the truth she carried home with her and were now holding their breath. She dropped her keys on the entryway table and stood there for a moment, not moving. The air felt heavier now, as though it knew something had broken. Outside, the sky had turned gray, the rain beginning again, soft and steady. She could hear it tapping against the windows, like a clock ticking through a version of time she no longer trusted. Emma walked into the living room and sat on the couch. She didn't cry. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze resting on nothing in particular. There were photographs on the mantel, her and Daniel smiling on a beach, laughing at their wedding, holding the first blurry ultrasound of the baby. They looked like people who had been sure of something, people who believed they were building something real. Now those images felt like fiction, a well-written lie, framed and displayed. Hours passed. The light dimmed. Still, she waited. When Daniel finally returned, the sky was nearly black. His steps were hesitant, his movement slow. He entered the house like someone stepping into a place he no longer belonged, eyes flicking to corners, unsure of where to begin. Emma didn't move from the couch. Daniel stood in the doorway, rain on his coat, his face pale. "Can we talk?" She looked at him then, but her eyes held none of the softness he once relied on. There was no invitation in her gaze, only clarity. "Talk," she said quietly. He sat on the armchair across from her, his posture collapsed, hands clasped between his knees like a man on the edge of confession. "I didn't plan for any of this," he began. "It just happened. I met Alyssa a year ago, at work. I didn't mean to get involved with her, but I was lost. And when we found out she was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave you. I didn't want to hurt you." Emma's voice was quiet even. "But you did." He looked at her then, really looked, and maybe for the first time he saw the full weight of what he'd done. Not just the betrayal of a marriage, but the quiet way he dismantled trust, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but this moment. "I've been a coward, me," he said. "I should have told you sooner. I should have been honest." Emma nodded slowly, not because she forgave him, but because she already knew. "You made me feel crazy, like I was imagining the distance, like I was asking too much." "I'm sorry," he whispered. She didn't respond. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," he said, voice trembling. "I want to be here. For you. For the baby." Emma stood. Her silence filled the room again, more powerful than any words. She walked to the hallway, opened the bedroom closet, and pulled out a duffel bag. Then she walked back, set it on the floor in front of him, and said with finality, "Leave." Daniel blinked, stunned. "Emma, please." But she was already turning away. "I need to protect what's mine," she said, hand resting on her belly. "And that doesn't include you anymore." He didn't fight her, maybe because he knew he'd already lost, or maybe because some part of him, deep down, understood this was the end he'd earned. He left quietly. The door closed behind him. No slamming, no shouting, just a soft click. Final. Finished. And in the silence that followed, Emma stood alone in the middle of their shared home. Her heart beat slow and steady. The baby kicked once, gently. She placed a hand on her stomach and whispered, "We're going to be okay." And this time, she believed it. The days that followed moved differently, slower, heavier, filled with strange quiets and sudden waves of memory. Emma found herself drifting through them like a ghost in her own life, going through motions she no longer recognized. She made breakfast. She folded laundry. She answered emails. But everything felt like it was being done by someone else, someone watching from outside her own skin. The bed felt too large now, the silence at dinner too sharp. Even the baby's kicks, once a source of pure joy, now felt tinged with sorrow. Not because she regretted the child, never that, but because the world the child was about to enter had shifted beneath her feet. At night, she would lie awake, the ceiling above her dim and distant, and replay conversations, moments, years. She started tracing the unraveling not to room 314, but to smaller things. Missed dinners, canceled plans, the way Daniel had started sleeping with his back to her, the way his phone was always turned face down. It hadn't started with the affair. It had started with a slow erosion of presence. One morning, as she folded a drawer full of baby clothes, soft onesies, tiny socks, cotton caps she had bought months ago with Daniel by her side, she felt a lump rise in her throat. Not grief, not anger. Something harder to name. It was the grief of being fooled. The ache of realizing you loved someone who no longer existed. She started journaling, not to make sense of it, not at first, just to get the weight out of her body and onto paper. Late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would write down her fears, that she wouldn't be enough for the baby, that her heart would harden, that she might never trust again. And slowly, her thoughts shifted from fear to something else, resolve. She began going for long walks every morning, just her and the baby, sometimes around the neighborhood, sometimes farther, into a park nearby where the trees arched overhead like a canopy and the paths wound in gentle curves. One morning she passed a group of women in a circle, sitting on yoga mats. A sign read, "Mothers in Mornings, Prenatal Support." She hesitated, then sat on the edge of the group. It was the first time she had said it out loud in front of strangers. "My husband cheated," she said quietly. "He has another child on the way. I'm due in 3 months, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this alone." There was no shock in their faces, only recognition. One woman reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "You are," she said. "Even if you don't feel it yet, you are." In the weeks that followed, Emma kept going back. The women there didn't offer easy answers. They didn't pretend to fix things, but they listened. And more than that, they understood. It wasn't long before she stopped saying "he left" and started saying "I let him go." There was power in that shift, a small but vital reclaiming of her own story. Daniel reached out a few times. He texted, asking how she was feeling. He offered to come to the next appointment. Once he left a voicemail saying he missed her, but she never responded. Not because she hated him, but because his voice no longer meant safety. Forgiveness, she was beginning to learn, was not the same as returning. She painted the nursery one weekend, a soft sage green, neutral and calm. She hung mobiles above the crib, lined the shelves with books she remembered from her own childhood. She imagined reading them aloud, imagined laughter, imagined a quiet kind of peace. There would be no perfect family, no polished version of what once was, but there would be a home. And in that home, there would be love, not broken or borrowed, but hers, whole, quiet, enduring. Even in the absence of trust, Emma was beginning to find something steadier, herself. Across town in a modest apartment just outside the city, Alyssa sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the unopened letter in her hands. Daniel had left earlier that morning, said he needed time to sort things out, whatever that meant. He always said the right things, with that familiar mix of guilt and charm that once made her feel chosen. Now it made her feel used. The room was cluttered with hospital paperwork, a half-packed suitcase, and unopened baby gifts sent by people she barely knew. The lavender bouquet from her hospital bedside had wilted days ago, the petals curling in on themselves like secrets too long kept. She unfolded the letter. It was one she had written weeks ago, but never sent, addressed to Daniel, full of truths she hadn't had the courage to speak aloud. "I knew you were married." The words stared back at her, inked in shaky penmanship. "You never said it outright, but I saw the ring mark on your finger the first night you took it off. I watched the way you avoided phone calls after 9. I wasn't naive. I just wanted to believe I could be the exception." The truth was, Alyssa had never been innocent in the way Daniel liked to frame her. She hadn't stumbled into the affair unaware. She had seen him, admired him, pursued him. At first it was a game, then it became something deeper, a desperate hope that maybe if she waited long enough, she could take the place of the woman he only mentioned in passing. She never expected to get pregnant, and when she did, she told herself it would force him to choose. But even now, weeks after the hospital, she still felt like the other woman, still felt like she was holding on to something that had never fully been hers. Daniel had changed since Emma found out. The warmth in his voice had cooled. His visits became shorter. his touches more distracted. He looked at Alyssa now the way people look at mistakes they don't know how to fix. Regret had crept into his silences, and she had started to see him differently too. He wasn't the man she thought he was. Not brave, not decisive, not capable of love without damage. He was a man who compartmentalized, who lied by omission, who ran from conflict until it collapsed around him. He wasn't here for her. Not really, he was here because he had nowhere else to go. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. She walked to the window and watched as a neighbor helped his toddler into a car seat, the child giggling. It hit her then, not as a thought, but a feeling in her chest like a slow-breaking wave. This wasn't the life she wanted, not a child raised in the shadow of someone else's family, not love built on secrecy and guilt, not a man who looked at her and saw only the consequences of his choices. Later that evening, Daniel returned. He looked tired. He sat on the edge of the bed without speaking. "I read your texts," Alyssa said. He glanced at her, wary. "The ones you sent Emma, you still love her." Daniel didn't deny it. Alyssa stood slowly, her hand on her belly. "You can't fix what you broke with her by staying here. And you can't undo this with me by pretending to love something you don't." He looked up at her, startled. "I don't want to raise this baby in a lie," she said. "If you're going to be in his life, it'll be as a father, not as a man trying to rewrite a story that was never his to tell." There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity. It was the first time she'd spoken without needing his approval. Daniel nodded slowly. For once, he didn't try to argue. That night she packed a second bag, called her sister in Vermont, booked a ticket for the end of the week. She didn't leave out of shame. She left to begin again, on her own terms, far from Daniel, far from Emma, far from the wreckage of a triangle that had collapsed under the weight of too many lies. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't waiting for anyone to save her from it. By late August, the air had begun to shift, warmer days giving way to cooler evenings, the sun setting earlier with each passing night. Emma found herself waking before dawn, the house still wrapped in silence, her body no longer needing permission to rise. The pregnancy had reached its final stretch, and everything inside her, bones, breath, thoughts, felt stretched thin but steady. She stood at the window most mornings, a mug of tea warming her hands, watching as the world slowly brightened. The street outside was quiet at that hour. Sometimes she imagined what her life might look like a year from now, pushing a stroller past those same houses, greeting neighbors she didn't yet know by name, smiling at a future that no longer felt fragile. Emma had stopped checking her phone, stopped waiting for messages. Daniel still reached out every so often. Simple updates, cautious check-ins, photos of books he'd bought for the baby. She never blocked him, but she never replied. There was nothing left to explain. The love she once held for him hadn't vanished. It had simply changed form. It no longer asked to be nurtured. It no longer demanded answers. It had folded itself into memory where it could rest without hurting her anymore. She kept attending the support group in the park. Week after week, she showed up, not always with stories to tell, but with presence. There was power in sitting in a circle of women who carried their own scars. They shared birth plans, fears, hopes. One of them, a woman named Claire, brought an extra smoothie for Emma every Thursday without asking. Another helped her install the car seat when Emma admitted she didn't know how. And slowly the loneliness began to lift. She prepared the nursery in quiet, intentional steps. She painted the last corner of the wall where Daniel had once promised to hang shelves. She did it herself now, humming along to old records, her belly swaying with each movement. She assembled the crib, built the dresser, folded the tiny clothes again and again, finding calm in repetition. On one of her walks through town, she passed a bookstore and wandered inside. She found a worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. its pages slightly yellowed, its corners softened by time. She bought it without hesitation. That night she read it aloud to her son, her voice soft in the dim light of the nursery. "Real isn't how you are made," she read, her hand resting on her belly. "It's a thing that happens to you." She closed the book and held it to her chest. Real. That was what this life had become. Not perfect, not fair, but undeniably, achingly real. And it was hers. One evening she received an email from Daniel's sister. Just a short note. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry. And I want you to know we're still your family, if you'll have us." Emma stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed her laptop without replying. It wasn't out of anger. It was because something in her had shifted. She was no longer reaching for what had broken, no longer trying to salvage pieces of a life that had already drifted out to sea. Instead, she focused forward. At her next appointment, the doctor told her she was strong, healthy, that the baby was positioned well. "You're almost there," the nurse smiled, squeezing her hand. "I know," Emma said. And she did. Because strength wasn't always loud. It didn't always roar. Sometimes it looked like a woman standing alone in her kitchen at dawn, humming to herself, painting over nail holes, whispering stories to someone who hadn't yet arrived. It looked like survival, reshaped into grace. And Emma, without needing anyone to witness it, had quietly become the strongest version of herself. It was just after midnight when the first wave came. Sharp, deep, and unmistakably different from the false alarms of the past week. Emma sat up slowly in bed, hand pressed to the side of her belly, breathing through the pain as it passed. The room was dark, silent except for the soft hum of the fan overhead. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, collecting herself. Outside, the street lights flickered against the damp pavement. A light rain had begun to fall. She'd prepared for this moment, practically and emotionally. Her hospital bag had been packed for days. The car seat was installed. The route to the hospital had been driven 3 times. Still, there was no rehearsing the quiet finality of this night. The knowledge that once she stepped through this threshold, everything would change. She called a car. She didn't call Daniel. At the hospital, the contractions grew closer, heavier. Nurses moved in and out of the room, their hands practiced, their voices calm. Emma breathed through the pain, gripping the sides of the bed, closing her eyes between waves. Time blurred. Hours passed like minutes. Her body took over. When the moment came, it arrived not in chaos, but in clarity. A long push, a surge of sound, and then, suddenly, silence. A beat. Then the baby cried, fierce and bright, like a voice announcing its place in the world. "It's a boy," the nurse said, smiling as she placed him on Emma's chest. Emma wept then, not out of sorrow or fear or relief, but something deeper, a kind of recognition. She looked down at him, tiny and perfect, and whispered, "Oliver." The name had come to her months ago, quietly one morning while walking through the park. She hadn't told anyone, not even Daniel. It was hers. A few hours later, after the room had quieted and the baby was sleeping, a soft knock came at the door. The nurse opened it gently. "There's someone here," she said. "He says he's the father." Emma didn't speak for a long moment. Then quietly, "Let him in." Daniel entered slowly, his face pale, his hair damp from the rain. He looked thinner than before, older somehow. When his eyes found Emma, they softened with something that looked like awe or regret, maybe both. He stepped closer, unsure of what he was allowed to feel. "He's beautiful," he said. Emma nodded. Daniel looked at the baby for a long moment. "Is he okay? Are you okay?" "We're both healthy," she said. There was silence. Not the strained kind, but something quieter, final. "I wasn't sure if you'd want me here," Daniel said. Emma looked at him, really looked, at the man who had once been her center and was now only part of her history. "I didn't," she said gently, "but I knew you'd come." He lowered his gaze. "I don't expect anything." "I know." She adjusted the blanket over Oliver's chest. He stirred, then settled again. "I named him Oliver James," she said. Daniel nodded. "James, after your grandfather?" Emma didn't answer. There was nothing cruel in her silence, just a line drawn gently between what had been and what was now. After a while, Daniel stepped back. "Thank you for letting me see him." Emma nodded once more, then turned her eyes back to her son. Daniel waited for a few seconds longer, then turned and left. The door clicked softly behind him. Emma exhaled, long and slow. Outside the window, the rain had stopped. The first gray threads of morning light were beginning to stretch across the sky. Emma looked down at Oliver, who had curled into sleep against her chest. She whispered, "Welcome to the world, baby." And for the first time in months, she felt no weight in the room. Only warmth. Only beginning. The days after Oliver's birth unfolded in quiet rhythms. Early feedings, diaper changes, short walks under the soft sun. The house no longer felt empty. It echoed now with tiny sounds. The flutter of breath, the gentle sighs of a newborn dreaming, the creak of the rocking chair, where Emma sat most nights, cradling her son in her arms long after the world had fallen asleep. She didn't rush to announce the birth. No social media posts, no wide emails. Only a few close friends knew. The rest of the world, including Daniel, was left to wonder. He still texted sometimes, never demanding, always cautious. "Can I drop off some things for the baby? Just checking in. Hope he's sleeping well." Emma rarely replied. When she did, it was brief, civil, detached. There was no hostility, only distance. The space she needed to reclaim her peace. What she didn't know was that Daniel had started writing letters, pages of them, tucked into a drawer he no longer opened. Not emails, not texts. Actual paper, ink, the slow labor of regret laid out line by line. He wrote in the quiet hours after work, alone in his apartment, the TV on mute, the dishes still in the sink. Sometimes he wrote to Emma, other times to Oliver, but he never sent them. "Emma," he wrote in one, "the silence you've given me is more honest than any words I ever gave you. You were always stronger than I was willing to admit. I see that now. I wish I'd seen it sooner." In another, addressed to his son, "Dear Oliver, you won't know me the way I hoped you would, not with bedtime stories or morning pancakes. Maybe one day we'll talk. Maybe you'll ask me why things happened the way they did. I'm not sure I'll have a good answer, but I want you to know I loved you from the moment I saw you, even if I didn't know how to deserve you." He kept the letters in a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet. Part of him hoped Emma might one day read them. Another part knew she never would. And perhaps that was how it should be. Some confessions are not for forgiveness. They are for the soul that wrote them. Meanwhile, Emma found healing in the quiet, in the ordinary. She took photos of Oliver's first smiles, read to him every night, sang lullabies out of tune. The nursery, once filled with expectation and loss, had become a sanctuary. One afternoon, as she folded laundry on the couch, she came across a tiny onesie Daniel had bought months ago, navy blue, with the words "Best Day Ever" stitched across the chest. Her hands paused, the fabric soft in her fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply folded it and placed it gently in the drawer. That night she opened her journal again. It had been weeks. She wrote, "He's beautiful and strong. I see pieces of him in you, but I don't let that undo me. I've learned that love doesn't always survive, but it doesn't mean it was wasted. You were a chapter. He's the rest of the story." Then she closed the book. There was no final act of closure. No dramatic goodbye. just the slow, quiet movement of a life being rebuilt, not in defiance of pain, but in gentle defiance of letting it win. Emma didn't need Daniel's letters. She was already writing her own story, and it no longer needed him in it. 3 years passed, swift and full. The house changed, first with the sound of Oliver's laughter, then with muddy shoes by the door, crayon marks on the walls, and shelves filled with books about dinosaurs, trucks, and bedtime adventures. Life settled into its own kind of music. Mornings were full of routine: cereal bowls, school shoes, rushed hugs. Evenings brought quiet stories, soft lullabies, and the comforting weight of a child's head resting against her shoulder. Emma grew into motherhood with grace and patience, not because it was easy, but because she had learned to carry both joy and grief in the same breath. There were hard days, long, lonely ones, but she faced them with resolve. She had created a life that was no longer about what she'd lost, but about what she'd chosen. One Wednesday morning in late spring, she walked Oliver to his preschool. The building was small and sunlit, the kind of place with finger-painted windows and the smell of fresh play dough in every corner. Oliver ran ahead, his backpack bouncing, his laughter carrying down the path. She stood at the gate speaking with one of the teachers when she heard a voice behind her. "Emma?" She turned slowly. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, eyes wide with cautious hope. He looked older, less polished, more worn. There was gray in his hair now, a tiredness around his eyes that no longer came from pretense but from living. He gave a small nod, unsure of whether he was welcome. Emma didn't smile, but she didn't flinch either. "It's been a long time," he said. "It has." He glanced at the children running in the yard. "Is that?" "Yes," she said simply. "That's Oliver." "Sahyan." Daniel's eyes followed the boy as he darted between the playground equipment. "He's so big. He's 3.5. Silence stretched between them. "I never stopped thinking about him," he said, quieter now. "Or you." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "Thinking and showing up are not the same thing," he nodded slowly. "I know." They stood there, two people who had once built a life together, now separated by time and choices too heavy to take back. "I've written letters," he said suddenly. "Dozens. I never sent them." Emma's face softened, not from sympathy, but from the quiet understanding that comes from having moved beyond something. "Maybe those letters were for you." Daniel smiled faintly, the edges of it sad. "He doesn't know who I am." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. He looked at her once more. "You did a good job, Emma." She glanced toward the yard. Oliver was helping another child up from the grass, his tiny voice full of patience and kindness. She felt a warmth rise in her chest. "I did the best I could." Daniel nodded, stepping back. He didn't ask to stay, didn't ask to be invited in. "Take care," he said. Emma watched him go. She felt no anger, no sorrow, only a faint ache, the kind that comes when you finally let something slip from your hands and realize it never belonged to you in the first place. She turned back to the schoolyard and waved to her son. He beamed and ran toward her, arms wide. As she knelt to catch him in her arms, she whispered, "I've got you." And that was all that mattered now. Daniel never returned to the preschool after that day. He thought about it, rehearsed conversations in his car, stared at photos on his phone, wondered what it would take to earn a place again. But every imagined moment ended the same way, with Emma's quiet finality, her steady gaze, and the boy who didn't know his face. He had spent years trying to undo a moment he couldn't erase. But time, he had learned, doesn't offer second chances, only space to live with the consequences. So he stopped writing letters. He let the silence become a kind of penance. He lived alone in a small apartment near the water. His job was steady, his evenings quiet. Sometimes he went days without speaking to anyone beyond polite greetings. Alyssa had left long ago, taken their child with her to Vermont. He sent money, occasionally birthday cards. There was no real relationship, just a thin thread of obligation that frayed a little more each year. And Emma, he hadn't heard from her since the preschool. Not a word, but he didn't expect to. Some forgiveness never arrives. Some losses stay lost. In another part of the city, Emma tucked Oliver into bed. He was 5 now, sharp, curious, full of questions. Tonight's was a quiet one, asked just before sleep took him. "Did I ever have a dad?" Emma hesitated, fingers brushing the boy's hair from his forehead. She had known this question would come. She'd felt it gathering in the spaces between stories, in the way he watched other children run to fathers on the playground. "You have me," she said softly. "You always have." Oliver nodded. It was enough for now. He closed his eyes, drifting into dreams. Emma sat by his bed a moment longer. Outside, the wind stirred in the trees. The night was calm. She thought of Daniel briefly, not with longing, not even with sadness, just as a chapter closed. A man who had once held everything and let it slip through his fingers. He had loved poorly and too late. She had loved honestly and walked away when that love was no longer returned. There was no revenge, no spectacle, just the quiet satisfaction of rebuilding, of raising a child in truth, of finding peace without apology. She stood, turned out the light, and stepped into the hallway. In the living room, the walls were now covered in drawings, crayon suns, crooked houses, stick figures with big smiling faces. A life created not by promises broken, but by presence kept. Somewhere across town, Daniel sat in his kitchen with a drink he didn't finish, staring at nothing. And in the stillness of their separate lives, the distance between them stretched into something final. Because not all stories end with reconciliation. Some end with silence. Not cruel, just earned. And in that silence, the bitter ending found its place, not with a bang, but with a quiet truth. She had moved on. He had not. And that was the cost of betrayal, paid not in anger, but in absence.